So let me begin by giving you a brief overview of the main players, a little bit about the history, and then talk about some of the sort of some claims or key ideas that are associated with the Austrian school. Of course, the reason this particular approach carries the label Austrian is because its founders were scholars at the University of Vienna in the late 19th century. I sometimes tell people, nowadays the term Austrian economics, maybe it isn't the best term because it is easily misleading. People think it has something to do with the country, but just as, in football, what they call the West Coast offense carries that label because it was Bill Walsh who came up with it, at Stanford. It doesn't have anything to do with geography, nor does the Austrian school. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as you all know, Vienna was one of the world's great cities. A lot of intellectual movements were there, Freudian psychoanalysis, logical positivism and philosophy, and what became known as the Austrian School of Economics as a movement, right, as a group of faculty and students at the university. They were part of this great intellectual milieu, and so it's not surprising that we would look to Vienna for important insights in economic thought. I mean, in the late 19th and early 20th century, probably the leading centers of thought in economics were Cambridge in the UK, a handful of other places, maybe Lausanne in Switzerland and Vienna. So they were big. It was a big deal. The founder of the Austrian school was, again, Karl Menger. Menger was actually a financial journalist who decided to investigate how prices were really formed and wrote a book about it, and that became his PhD thesis, and he became a very eminent scholar at Vienna. He had a number of important students and disciples who attracted other students and disciples, and before long you had a movement. One of the most famous Austrians among the famous Austrians of these early generations were Ludwig von Mises, who was a student of one of Menger's students, and F.A. Hayek, who was a younger colleague of Mises and a student of another one of Menger's students. Hayek became pretty famous in the 1930s. He wrote some articles and books on business cycles, and he became known internationally as the major opponent, or one of the major opponents, of John Maynard Keynes. And of course, nowadays, Keynes is much more famous. Everybody knows what a Keynesian is. And it's sometimes forgotten that in the 1930s, Keynesian economics was often contrasted to Austrian economics or Hayek's economics as kind of two alternative approaches for thinking about the Great Depression. Unfortunately for the Austrians, Keynes's ideas kind of won the day, and there's a variety of reasons for that, which we can talk about. And by the late 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, almost everyone, at least in macroeconomics, was a Keynesian of some sort. Keynes's ideas kind of won the day. Hayek and his fellow Austrians were sort of forgotten. They were kind of lost to history. So during what people sometimes call the neoclassical synthesis, which means kind of mathematical microeconomics, econometrics and statistics combined with Keynesian macroeconomics, that became the dominant paradigm, and the Austrians became sort of a footnote in the history of economic thought. However, in the 1960s and 1970s, there was a rebirth of interest in this Austrian tradition. Mises moved to the US in the 1940s, and he became very well known in certain circles, sort of as a conservative free market thinker. Hayek won the Nobel Prize in 1974, which brought a lot of attention to the Austrian school. There were several groups of younger scholars who came together in that period to create what might be called an Austrian revival. So that today, there is a sort of a vibrant Austrian movement. There are academic journals that are devoted to the Austrian approach. There are societies. There are conferences. In fact, there's one that I'm participating in called the Austrian Economics Research Conference, which will be held at the Mises Institute in March. So the Austrian approach has all the trappings of a school of thought or a movement or a distinct sort of identity. And since 2008, the financial crisis, the Austrians have gotten a lot more attention than they did in the decades prior. A lot of folks are saying, well, the mainstream macroeconomists didn't seem to anticipate the financial crisis, and none of them can really explain it. And the crisis seems to fit well with, and we'll talk about this in just a moment, sort of the way Austrians view aggregate fluctuations. There's sort of an investment boom followed by a bust. Doesn't seem to fit the Keynesian model so well. So even the mainstream press is starting to look at Hayek. And you guys don't know this, but most of your students, or many of your students, have seen these really great rap videos produced by Russ Roberts, who does Econ Talk, and a guy named John Popola. If you just do a Google search, it's really clever. They did these videos to try to teach Austrian economics with, this is supposed to represent Hayek, and this is John Maynard Keynes, and they engage in a rap battle, which is really, they're really pretty funny. Your students have seen these, but you guys would be clueless about rap. Let me back up for just a moment. Whenever you talk about the Austrian school, most economists are sort of puzzled. Say, what do you mean by even a school? I mean, what's a school of thought? As most of you know, economics tends to be a pretty single paradigm, uniparadigmatic discipline compared to other academic disciplines like sociology or psychology, where you have lots of different paradigms and perspectives. In sociology, you have rational choice thinkers who do formal modeling. You have postmodern sociologists. You have narrative sociologists, behavioral sociologists, and so on. Again, to put it in a business school context, economics is more like finance and accounting, right? Where there's not a whole lot of argument about fundamental methods and fundamental concepts. There's a lot of applied work that fits within a fairly straightforward unified paradigm, compared to management or marketing, right, where you have lots of different competing paradigms. So economics is a discipline where there is one dominant paradigm, and most of the research and teaching fits within that dominant paradigm, but there are a few schools of thought on the periphery. Marxism might be another example. For a while, behavioral economics was out of the mainstream, but it's become more mainstream lately, right? Most economists subscribe to what Murray Rothbard called the Whig theory of history, or the Whig theory of intellectual history, which holds that in any scientific discipline, good ideas always displace bad ideas. So just as if you were studying physics, in an intro physics class, you don't need to go back and read Isaac Newton, right? Likewise, if you're taking an intro econ class, you don't need to read Adam Smith, right? And so people like Carl Menger and Ludwig von Mises, maybe they were important in their day. If they contributed anything useful, it's already been incorporated into the current textbooks. And those ideas are already, in mathematical form in the leading journals. So there's no need to bother going back and reading these old writers. But that's really kind of that way of thinking about the history of science and the sociology of science does not at all fit with what actual historians of science and sociologists of science have said. It's not all invariant. Some of it might have been lost and not made it into the current text. The Thomas Kuhn's book in the 1962, right? Structure of Scientific Revolutions that popularized the term paradigm made us realize that, it's not always the case that the new paradigm is more corrected than the old paradigm it displaced. There are all kinds of institutional and sociological and intellectual reasons why one paradigm tends to displace another. And at any moment, there's what Kuhn called normal science, research that takes place within the confines of the dominant paradigm, which says what questions you should ask and what methods you should use and so forth. But there's always some, what he called extraordinary science around the periphery. And I would say that most of Austrian economics research today, not all, but most, kind of fits in this extraordinary science category, meaning just that it's sort of outside the dominant paradigm, and that's why most of you haven't heard of it. Even those of you who have studied economics or majored in it or even have graduate degrees in economics, you may have never heard of this stuff because it is not all invariant. And it's not all in the American Economic Review. So you have to bear with me for the rest of this conversation. Take it on faith that it's worth looking at some ideas that kind of fell through the cracks. Maybe they have something to teach us that we're not going to learn just from looking at the government stuff. Okay, let me just mention a few of these contributions. I mean, with a brief, the minuscule amount of time I was allocated by this guy, I can't possibly convey the richness and usefulness of the Austrian tradition, but I'll just lay out a few kind of statements or propositions and then mention a few particular applications to management, and marketing, and finance, and so forth, and then I'll stop. The heart of Austrian economics, from my point of view, is its micro theory or its price theory. So most of you, if you took Econ 101, you drew supply and demand curves, and maybe you did it in equations, and you solved for the equilibrium configuration of prices and quantities, and depending on how fancy you were, you used calculus or set theory or something else. The Austrians had a very different approach to understanding price formation that has been called causal realist or causal realistic. So the Austrians are kind of Aristotelian in the sense that they view economic processes not in kind of mechanistic Newtonian terms, but more in terms of sort of cause and effect. We want to understand not what configuration of prices constitutes an equilibrium, but why the prices that we have today are the prices that we have, what caused them to be what they are, what causes prices to go up and down, and so forth. It's realistic in the sense that Austrians are interested in real phenomena, not abstract hypothetical models of the economy in which we solve for some equilibrium price that doesn't exist in any actual market. They're interested in explaining real prices. And that leads to an emphasis on adjustment processes and not so much interest in equilibrium states. I mean, 95% of what mainstream economists do is characterizing equilibria, solving for conditions under which equilibria will obtain. There is a little bit of so-called dynamics, but that's really an addendum, right? Austrians are more interested in causal processes through time, not in equilibrium states. Of particular interest to you guys, especially those in strategy, is Austrian tradition is unique in economics in the way it approaches resources or capital, to use the economics term. And Austrians have always emphasized that capital is heterogeneous. That's something that is not in most of neoclassical economics production theory, where capital is sort of uninteresting and is mostly treated as an aggregate sort of homogeneous thing, the letter K, right? You have production function with K and L, and yeah, okay, maybe all K and all L are not identical, but that's a second order thing we don't need to worry about. Austrians think that resource heterogeneity is fundamental to production and to how economies work. Menger himself famously introduced this idea that you can categorize goods and services in sort of an order of production, right, where consumer goods are at the bottom, and then goods that are used to produce consumer goods are one level up, and then goods that are used to produce those goods are another level up, and so forth. And Menger argued that the reason that capital goods, machines, land, natural resources, and so on, the reason that those are traded in markets and that the reason they command prices in markets is because people really value the stuff that those goods and services make, right? So value is assigned by consumers to final goods and services and then imputed backwards or upward up the chain of command, right? So if a particular resource can only be used to produce one consumer good or service, and the demand for that consumer good or service falls, the value of that resource falls or may be eliminated. One of Menger's students, a guy named Bohm-Bawerk, coined the term roundaboutness to characterize the overall capital structure in the economy. So a more advanced economy where production takes place in more stages, and so there are more, it takes many, many rounds of intermediate goods before you get to the final good, is sort of more complex and more, he called it more roundabout than an economy with a flatter production structure in which you only have a few stages from final production to consumption. So, hunter-gatherers or something, they have spears, those are capital goods, but you just make the spears and then you hunt the animals and you eat them, as opposed to, modern production agriculture where you have many, many, many layers, many stages. So we use much more roundabout production methods now. As we'll see in just a moment, the heart of Austrian business cycle theory is the idea that this capital structure can get messed up by actions of the central bank and the monetary authority. Another one of Menger's students named Wieser, he developed what is now has become a little bit, at least to some degree, integrated into neoclassical economics. It's called marginal productivity theory, that the prices of capital goods are determined by their marginal contribution to output as that output is valued by consumers. If you know how to solve for the marginal revenue product of a factor and use that to explain its price, that idea comes from Wieser. A guy named Ludwig Lachmann pointed out that capital goods are characterized by what he called multiple specificities. So if you know the transaction cost economics notion of relationship-specific investment, Lachmann pointed out that most capital goods, they're not purely specific to one production process, but they're not infinitely substitutable, right? You know, your desktop computer, whatever, it can be used for lots of different things that we use computers for, and it can also be used as a door stopper, right? But it's not very effective when used in that latter use. So there's some substitutability among capital goods across different production processes, but it's limited by the specificity of that capital good. And Israel Kirzner, who some of you know from entrepreneurship theory, pointed out also that the right way to characterize the attributes of capital goods is in terms of subjective perceptions by entrepreneurs of how those capital goods would be used in production. Let me say something about entrepreneurship. So the Austrians have talked about entrepreneurs a lot, and the entrepreneur plays a pretty central role in Austrian theorizing. One of the ways it's different from contemporary, the way most economists think about it, is most economists think of entrepreneurship as just sort of a little separate add-on to most of the theory. So if the Austrians did not conceive of entrepreneurship as startups or self-employment. Not that startups and self-employment aren't important and interesting and do not involve entrepreneurship, but they thought entrepreneurship was something much more broad than that. That the whole process of resource allocation is an entrepreneurial one. And so entrepreneurship is right in the middle of our understanding of the market, not something that's on the periphery, right? So now the exact ways that they characterize the entrepreneur vary from thinker to thinker. A lot of you know Israel Kirzner's famous concept of entrepreneurship as alertness to profit opportunities, which takes place in lots of different contexts, not just startups, right? Not just self-employment, but in many different productive contexts, and all of them, right? Or what I, in my own work, have called the judgment-based approach, which builds on the Austrians and Frank Knight. And I'm sure if you haven't already, I would encourage you to read this excellent book called Organizing Entrepreneurial Judgment, which was published in 2012, written by myself and Nikolai Foss, explaining this sort of Austrian influence, judgment-based approach to entrepreneurship. But the point is that whether it's alertness or judgment, these take place in every transaction, in every production process, regardless of firm size or firm age. The way Mises put it is the following. Mises says, it is impossible to eliminate the entrepreneur from the picture of a market economy. The various complementary factors of production cannot come together spontaneously. They need to be combined by the purposive efforts of men, of people, aiming at certain ends, and motivated by the urge to improve their state of satisfaction. In eliminating the entrepreneur, one eliminates the driving force of the whole market system. Mises has often been quoted as saying that entrepreneurship is the driving force of the whole market system. Kirzner titled one of his books, The Driving Force of the Market. But what Mises meant by the driving force, again, was not just firms that patented biotech, right? By driving force, he meant the actions of individuals in the market system to acquire resources, to combine resources, to deploy them in particular ways in anticipation of making money. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it isn't. But the whole process of moving resources around and producing things that consumers will want to buy and so forth is itself an entrepreneurial process by nature. Okay. Think about applications a little bit. And so I have been assigned like a 6-hour block this afternoon with a doctoral student. It's really 2.5 hours, I guess, but it seems like a lot. To go over these applications in much more detail, and you guys are welcome to drop in, I guess, if you want to. But what are some ways that we could think about how this might apply? Now, some of what I'm about to say, depending on your own research area, your own background, you might respond, duh. Well, of course we understand that that's how it works in a market. That's what we do in strategy or marketing or HR or OB or whatever. That's fine. So some of what I'm telling you is what a lot of you already do, or the sort of assumptions you have about how an economy works are already kind of Austrian, whether you've ever heard that term or not. Right? But I want to further argue that focusing on some of these Austrian contributions more explicitly can provide even further insight and maybe suggest new research directions for the kind of applied work that most of us do. So just to take competition, for example. You all took Econ 101 at some point, and you know that the way mainstream economists use the word competition is completely different from the way ordinary human beings use that word. Right? We think of sporting contests or a race or whatever. I mean, a competitive market in the textbook sense, Jason will agree with me, means essentially a market where nothing happens. Right? We have an almost infinite number of tiny buyers and sellers, all of whom are price takers, none of whom can influence market outcomes. They're completely passive. Right? There's no actual competing among firms. It's the absence of competition that defines a perfectly competitive market, ironically. Right? Austrians have always viewed competition as a dynamic process of actual rivalry that takes place through time with big players as well as small players. The competitiveness of a market, from an Austrian perspective, would not be measured by the concentration ratio, the number of firms in the industry, the degree of market power of incumbents or whatever, but rather it would be measured by the actual ability of potential entrants to come in, the ways in which firms respond to what other firms are doing, and the way they interact with customers and suppliers and so forth. So, if you think of sort of Porterian positioning theory, I mean, Porter's whole shtick in competitive strategy was essentially taking the neoclassical economics notion of competition and flipping it around, right? So as in an industrial organization econ class, they would say, okay, high concentration ratio is bad, barriers to entry are bad, having lots of small firms is good. And Porter said, aha, I can make are we still taping? I can make a blank load of consulting money if I can say to firms, hey, concentration ratios, having a high concentration ratio is good for you. And I can teach you how to erect barriers to entry. And I can teach you how to create and sustain and exploit market power. I'm being a little unfair to Professor Porter if you're watching. So you think of the kind of approach to strategy that you might associate with Edith Penrose or David Teese or dynamic capabilities theory. Right? There's no competition is about doing things over time. Right? It's about exploiting capabilities and developing capabilities. Market share is not the main metric. So-called supernormal profits are transitory. If you've read all the stuff on so-called temporary advantage, that the search for sustained competitive advantage may be a waste of time. In a dynamic, ever-changing market economy, rewards are often short-term. You have to continue to innovate to stay on top of the competition and so forth. A lot of work on innovation strategy and innovation policy, right, is ultimately about doing better than your rivals over time, not being in some sort of competitive equilibrium with your rivals. So Joseph Schumpeter's work on innovation and economic growth is important here. Just as a footnote, Joseph Schumpeter is Austrian by nationality and was educated at the University of Vienna, but is not really part of the Austrian tradition as I'm describing it. He was a great admirer of Walras, and Schumpeter, though he did not write in mathematics, thought that the sort of mathematical version of general equilibrium theory was the correct way to think about an economy. Not really an Austrian in the sense that we mean it today. Some of you know the stuff by Priem and others on so-called demand-side strategy is essentially exploiting the Karl Menger's insight that it's consumer demand that ultimately creates profits. right? It's not that, and that demands of consumers through imputation are what determine factor prices and rewards to entrepreneurs and so forth. You know, we could talk a lot about entrepreneurship, as you guys know, especially as you move away from what I, in my own work, have called sort of the occupational approach to entrepreneurship, where we define being an entrepreneur as a job category, you know, self-employment as opposed to paid employment. If we think of entrepreneurship as opportunity discovery, or as the exercise of judgment, or as some kind of creativity or something broad, what I call a functional rather than an occupational notion, then almost all of that research, and both the theoretical work and what's in the applied journals, right, is implicitly and often explicitly based on Kirchner and Mises and Knight and some of the other figures that I've mentioned. We can talk about business cycle if you want. That could take us off on a long tangent. Vance doesn't want me to do that. But the Austrians have a particular approach to understanding booms and busts that's very different from the contemporary Keynesian approach, or even Milton Friedman's monetarism, or Lucas's rational expectations view. And a lot of people have found that congenial as a way of understanding what's been going on the last 4 or 5 years. But people in finance and accounting might be particularly interested in the way Austrians treat bubbles. As you know, the Nobel Prize this year went to Eugene Fama and Robert Schiller, and then Hansen, who did some econometrics on it. And people often contrasted the views of Fama and Schiller on bubbles. Right, so Fama, the father of one of the fathers of rational expectations, right, essentially argues that bubbles cannot exist. He doesn't think the concept of an asset bubble is even coherent, right? Schiller thinks that asset bubbles are everywhere, and they're the result of irrational exuberance. They're kind of random. They just pop up because people are not rational. The Austrians, oddly enough, hold what I would call a very balanced middle ground position. Right? Austrians think there are asset bubbles. There was a real estate bubble in the last decade, and there was a tech bubble in the 1990s, and there may now be a agricultural land bubble, or different kinds of commodity bubbles, and maybe even a higher education bubble. But that bubbles are not just sort of random, the result of irrationality. They can systematically be explained in terms of government policy. Not only monetary policy, but also industry-specific policies like housing policy in the 2000s, which we can talk about if you want. And they're not exactly predictable in the sense that you know exactly where a bubble is going to emerge and when a bubble is going to pop, right? But they're understandable in terms of sort of economic fundamentals. In terms of organizational design, a lot of what's in our current literature and other ideas that we have about delegation and decentralization, right, is often implicitly based on Austrian reasoning. You know, Hayek famously characterized knowledge in an economy, information or knowledge, in terms of its accessibility and transferability. So Hayek's argument against socialism, against central planning, was that information is tacit, hard to make explicit and to communicate explicitly from person to person, and widely dispersed throughout a market economy. Therefore, you need decentralized forms of organization. You need the free market with free prices and so forth, rather than top-down central planning by the state for reasons of dispersed tacit knowledge. And of course, that's a very familiar argument in contemporary understanding of organizational design. Right, that a lot of the ways that we delegate authority within a firm, the ways that we monitor, the ways that we provide incentives as managers, has to do with trying to take advantage of the fact that people throughout an organization have different kinds of knowledge that is not easily articulated, cannot be encapsulated in data that can be transmitted up the line. And so you do what Jensen and Mecklin call the co-location of decision authority and specific knowledge, or tacit knowledge. Right? We can understand a lot of issues in delegation. Call it Hayek versus Coase. If you associate Coase with the notion that firms are kind of these central coordinating agents as a substitute for market allocation. This is Coase's famous Nature of the Firm paper from 1937. As opposed to the Hayekian idea that you want to take advantage of delegated, of dispersed knowledge even within organizations, then maybe you say, well, the optimum is some kind of mix of both. I don't know, do you have anybody from accounting? I mean, there's some work on transfer pricing that builds explicitly on Mises and Hayek and their analysis of socialism, and the way that under socialist central planning, the way that capital goods prices are determined by formula has some interesting implications for how multi-divisional firms both do and should try to allocate profit and loss across operating units according to how they set transfer prices. It's an interesting article that some of you may have seen. It's published in Academy of Management Review. As mainstream as you can get in management in the early 90s by Robert Jacobson, called The Austrian School of Strategy. And it's worth looking up because Jacobson gives a little overview of what the Austrian school is. I would have given the overview a little bit differently from the way he did, but I think it's well worth reading. And then he lays out a series of propositions, the same kinds of things that I've mentioned here, as developing or starting to build what he thinks is an alternative paradigm for doing strategic management. So especially those of you in management and entrepreneurship might want to take a look at this piece, but the rest of you in other disciplines might find it interesting as well to see how a very mainstream strategy scholar would attempt to extract some insight from Austrian thinking. And I mean, as Van kindly mentioned, I mean, a lot of my own work, most of which appears in mainstream journals in entrepreneurship and management and some econ journals, is about trying to exploit Austrian insights and combine them with insights from other approaches to deal with very practical applied problems. But there are a number of scholars who are doing this. In fact, if you look at, if you just do some Google Scholar searches with the keywords like Austrian or Mises or Hayek or whatever, in the core disciplines of your own journals, the core journals of your own disciplines, you'll find quite a few contemporary articles that are trying to do the same kind of thing. So there's a little bit of a movement in business school scholarship to take the Austrians a little bit more seriously. And just as a closing note, I have often suggested, I get doctoral students who come to me and say, well, I'm really interested in the Austrian School of Economics. I want to get a PhD and be a professor. Where should I go to get my PhD in economics? And depending on the student's circumstances, I often say, given your interests and given the job prospects, you really ought to consider getting a PhD in management or entrepreneurship or finance or marketing or accounting, partly because most business school scholars or ag econ, most business school scholars and ag econ scholars are less uptight about labels compared to their brethren in arts and sciences economics departments. And it's not such a big deal to be working outside of a dominant intellectual paradigm because people are interested in practical insight and what's useful, and they don't really care so much if it's Austrian or Australian or whatever. And so I think I've often encouraged young scholars to try to find applications for Austrian insights in the kinds of disciplines that are represented around this table. So the future of the Austrian school may not be in economics or in the economics departments. It may be in business and in business schools. So with that, I'll start.